So welcome to the fourth and final for this term seminar of the Manchester JMCE Centre of Excellence, organised through the Universities of Chester, Manchester Metropolitan University and the University of Manchester. My name is Paul Tobin. I'm a senior lecturer in European politics here at the University of Manchester. I say here, this is obviously our attic in my house. I'm sure lots of you are back home as well at the moment. And it's a pleasure today to be welcoming Professor Dr. Louise Simón, who is based at Vrije Universiteit Brussel in Brussels, in Belgium, where he's been based alongside some other partnerships with Columbia University in America, and also as a visiting fellow at Johns Hopkins University in the USA as well, but otherwise has been based in Brussels now for a good 10 years and has a phenomenal set of insights he can share with us about security studies, international politics and geopolitics as well. And it's on those topics that he's going to be speaking with us today. So without further ado, we have our final speaker of the term. He'll be speaking for 20-30 minutes about his topic. Professor Dr. Louise Simón, welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks also for the kind introduction. Thanks to you and Dimitris and Konstantinos and the whole team at the JMCE Center of Excellence, Manchester JMCE Center of Excellence, for the invite. I would say it's a pleasure to be here, but I'm actually at home, as most of you are. And don't get me wrong, I mean, home is always a fascinating place to be, but I'd much rather be in Manchester with all of you now. So hopefully we can remedy that in the future. The title of my talk today is Subject and Object, Europe in Sino-American Competition. And I realize it's a bit of a tricky title because Europe will probably be subject and object simultaneously. But I'll get to that part in a bit. As you surely know, the problem of Sino-American competition has begun to structure scholarly and policy discussions on Europe's strategic outlook. So what I'd like to do is actually bring to your attention two debates that I think are deeply intertwined and can help us better sort of unpack that problem. One is the debate on Europe as a subject, which is often associated with the EU and the concept of European strategic autonomy. And the other one is the debate on Europe as an object or battleground in Sino-American competition. And the debate on Europe as a subject relates to how the EU should position itself in Sino-American competition. Should it team up with the United States? Should it aim for some form of neutrality, as some people used to advocate? Or should it simply reject the rivalry frame of Sino-American competition? I think that's a fascinating debate, but it's going to be complicated by a less pleasant debate, which is the problem of Europe as an object or battleground in Sino-American competition. That's a debate primarily about how external powers, in this case China and the United States, can leverage existing European divisions to maximize their influence in and over Europe, right? My sense is that internal divisions and external penetration are sort of two sides of the same coin, in the sense that they feed off each other. And Europe may now be experiencing the rough end of both, in the sense that over the last decade or so, the economic, migration, security, Brexit, and now COVID crises have animated a number of cleavages in Europe, within and between countries. And those cleavages are there for powerful external actors to leverage. So from the perspective of an external power who is typically looking for wedge issues to divide and rule, today's Europe is filled with opportunities. So what I want to do is sort of try and use this sort of subject and object lens, or subject versus object lens, to try and unpack the puzzle of Europe in Sino-American competition. All right, so let me just get started. As you probably know, the notion of China as a long-term strategic competitor of the United States has sort of has gained plenty of traction in the last few years. The 2017 U.S. National Security Strategy argued that China is challenging American power, influence, and interests across political, economic, and military arenas, and seeking to change the international order in its favor. In a similar sort of spirit, the unclassified summary of the 2018 National Defense Strategy called on the United States to expand its competitive space, the competitive space in its relationship with China, and labeled China as a long-term strategic competitor. Both the national security strategy and national defense strategy are also crystal clear about the fact that that competition with China is neither confined to the East Asian region nor to the military domain, as important as those two dimensions may be. And perhaps more relevantly today, the notion that the US finds itself in a long-term strategic competition with China also appears to have won strong support among Democrats. Senior Obama advisors now involved in Biden's transition team have referred to competition with China as more of a condition than a strategy. And the Democratic Party's 2020 platform urged the United States to stand up to China in order to shape the unfolding Pacific century. So against that sort of backdrop, meaning the growing consensus in the United States about the recognition of China as a long-term strategic competitor, the question that I want to address specifically is how may Europeans position themselves in a context of Sino-American competition? Interestingly, most European foreign policy experts and officials and pundits choose to either provide an ambiguous answer to that question, as in not choosing either side, or to reject the premise of the question altogether. So last year, for instance, when the whole debate on Sino-American competition really began to make political headway in Brussels and across Europe, some experts even argued that the EU should aim for some form of geopolitical equidistance, not equidistance, because it's never going to be equidistance for obvious reasons, but for some sort of a space in between the United States and China and assert its own autonomy, right, vis-a-vis both. Over the last year or so, I would argue that the notion of equidistance has definitely lost appeal in Brussels, perhaps partly because of the realization that the historical, political, and cultural bonds between Europe and America are so deep that equidistance is simply nonsense. Perhaps because of COVID and the fact that it has led to a more negative perception of China across Europe. Whatever the reason, I think the EU's attitude towards the problem of the issue of Sino-American competition has now become slightly more nuanced. The point is not so much equidistance, but rather rejecting the frame of Sino-American competition itself and rejecting the idea that Sino-American competition should be a referent at all for EU foreign policy, not least because this is a framework that imposes a binary choice on Europeans and underscores, to go back to the theme of the talk, the notion of Europe as an object, right? Instead, or so the argument goes, Europeans should strive for a new framework, namely the preservation of the liberal rules-based multilateral order. That is what EU High Representative Josep Borrell refers to as the Sinatra doctrine, meaning as in Europe going its own way and not China's way or America's way. And since the EU's way is a multilateral way, it actually also implies bringing the US back into the fold of the liberal rules-based international order, but also China, but also getting China to play ball multilaterally. I think that sounds terrific, but there are a couple of questions there. I mean, A, does the EU have the cohesion and power to reject the frame of Sino-American competition, let alone advance a new frame? And B, and most importantly, I would argue, given the increasingly antagonistic relationship between the United States and China, is it realistic to expect that a widely accepted rules-based multilateral order is even possible today? Now, with that as a sort of quick intro, I want to break the rest of my talk, the next 15 minutes or so, 15, 17 minutes, into three main sort of themes. A is the evolving relationship between power and order, and more specifically between Sino-American competition and the current international order. B, the question of whether Europe is in a position to actually reject the frame of Sino-American competition. And C, and relatedly, the viability of the concept of European strategic autonomy. All right, so just a few words on that. After World War II, and you surely have heard about this, the United States is you're surely acquainted with this, is said to have set up an international order that was meant to further its interest and influence. I think this argument is eloquently deployed by Princeton professor John Eikenberry in his seminal work, Liberal Leviathan. Eikenberry makes a fairly intuitive point, which is that international orders, norms, and institutions tend to reflect power balances. They're created and maintained by powerful states or coalitions forming around them. And the fact that the international order, the current international order, the post-World War II international order, had to incorporate the sensitivities and preferences of a wide diversity of states, including Western Europeans, by the way, does not change the fact that it is, and remains by and large a US-led order, according to Eikenberry, and I would agree with that. Now, so what was from a US viewpoint, what was the strategic rationale for that order, right? So during the Cold War, the main geostrategic objective of the United States was to prevail in the long-term strategic competition, and that's also how it was defined in US government documents with the Soviet Union. A Soviet Union which was openly hostile to an international order and a political and economic order that was primarily confined to the Atlantic and parts of the Asia Pacific. So we could say that US global geopolitical and security interests, i.e. prevailing in the competition with the Soviet Union, were in sync with an order that excluded the Soviet Union and its satellite countries and actually helped the United States strengthen its economic, political, and security ties to key European and East Asian allies. So in other words, the international order was not neutral in power political terms. It reflected US and Western interests and values and was strategically and systematically leveraged by the United States in its long-term competition with the Soviets. Now, the collapse of the Soviet Union sort of cleared the path for the so-called globalization of this order. I think that was illustrated by the progressive integration of Central and Eastern Europe, Central and South Asia, Southeast Asia, and even parts of the Middle East into that order. And even also that of Russia and China, however fragile or selective such integration may have turned out to be. Critically, I would argue, between the end of the Cold War and today, competition between great powers, great power competition, has kept a rather low profile in international politics in the context of unipolarity or US hegemony or primacy, take your pick. And this may have given many the impression that the globalization of the order was neutral in power political terms, but in my view, it wasn't. It was underwritten by US and Western power all along. Now, if you fast forward to 2020/2021, what does the return of great power competition, because I think there is a consensus around this idea that there's a return of great power competition. Most powers are recognizing that, the EU is, the US is. So what does the return of great power competition mean for the future of the US-led international order? And I think we often talk about the liberal or rules-based order, actually forgetting its main attribute, which is the fact that it is US-led. I think that's important for two reasons. The first is that the order is liberal and rules-based to the extent that it's led by a power who upholds those values. And the second is that the order is useful and therefore sustainable to the extent that it advances US interests, or at least from a US perspective, of course. And what is the main US interest right now? Well, according to US government documents, is to prevail in the long-term strategic competition with China. So then the key question becomes, the key question that US foreign policy experts across the aisle are trying to grapple with in relation to the international order is, can it help or hinder US objectives in the context of competition with China? I would argue that the relationship between great power competition and the international order is very different today from what it was during the Cold War, which is when the current order was created and took root. Unlike during the Cold War period, America's main geopolitical competitor today, i.e. China, is engaging vigorously, even if selectively, with market capitalism, both at home and internationally, unlike the Soviet Union. Internationally, China has apparently embraced many of the principles, norms, and institutions which it has joined that make up the multilateral order. This has led to concerns in some quarters in the States that Beijing has come to the conclusion that integrating into and selectively supporting the existing international order is the best way to subvert or transform an institutional and normative infrastructure that is perceived by China to advance US interests and hinder China's development as a great power. So in contrast to the Soviet Union, we could argue that China seems to be mounting a challenge to the US-led international order from within. It's following the sort of Corleone approach, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, if you will. Moreover, and also to a much greater extent than the Soviet Union, China has the economic mass and potential to give the US a good run for its money. And its pragmatic strategy of selective engagement actually provides Beijing with a platform to lure other countries into its orbit and away from the United States. So a couple of questions for you. Are the international order and US geostrategic interests parting ways? Should the United States try and reform and protect the existing international order, or should it conclude that an order that was specifically designed to prevail in competition with the Soviets is unsuitable in the context of competition with China and therefore pull the plug on the order? I think these are difficult questions that underscore the key link between great power competition and international order. And it's also an example of an issue that President Trump and President-elect Biden may see differently, in the sense that President Trump clearly saw the order as a liability in competition with China, and President Biden seems to be of a different opinion. So it's an example of a divergence on tactics. We can get back to the whole Trump versus Biden later on if you want. But what does this mean for Europe? Well, up until recently, at least, and let's see how this debate evolves because it's a moving target, the predominant opinion in Europe, and certainly in EU circles, was that the EU should avoid choosing sides in Sino-American competition, or even more generally, as I was saying, reject the frame of Sino-American competition as a meaningful referent for EU foreign policy. It's about rejecting the frame, the rivalry frame, for both normative reasons and also power-related calculations, because it imposes a binary choice on the EU. For some in Europe, this attitude of eluding the problem of Sino-American competition and rejecting frames emanates out of frustration with President Trump's repeated attempts to divide Europeans and treat Europe as an object, to go back to the theme. A frustration with Trump's attitude towards the EU specifically, whom Trump has referred to as a foe of the United States and almost as bad as China. But for others in Europe, this all runs deeper than Trump. It's about asserting European strategic autonomy, regardless of who is in the White House. It's about the promise of Europe as a subject. So it is unclear to me what the EU's take on this will be as Biden takes office. So that's something to watch, I would say. I would say, but going back to sort of the Trump years, which is where would sort of set the tone for the debate in Europe on this, I would say that it's certainly understandable and even legitimate for Europeans to stand up to Trumpian bullying and reject the notion of a transactional relationship with the United States. However, I think the notion of resorting to other great powers, let alone China, to build diplomatic leverage on Washington is very, very tricky. I think this could be politically very damaging, and it would prove highly divisive and corrosive within a Europe that is largely, I think, still a byproduct of American power. I think it's important to remember that U.S. power and strategy played a key role in the genesis of the European community, not only through the Marshall Plan, through American support for the reindustrialization and remilitarization of West Germany, and through the NATO security guarantee. And this is not just ancient history. The United States also played a critical role in the configuration of today's European Union, notably through its key role in German reunification and Eastern enlargement. And I think today, Central and Eastern European states, which are part of the EU, many of them have a higher political allegiance to Washington than they do to Brussels, because it is their security guarantor, right? And they see it also as the foundation of their political autonomy, the transatlantic relationship, that is. And I think the relevance of the US to the security of Europe and the fact that many EU member states, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, but not only, may have a higher political allegiance to Washington than even Brussels, gives us some clues about what the limits of Europe's positioning vis-a-vis Sino-American competition are. I think we also need to bear in mind that the US has been ambivalent towards China for a long time, in the sense that previous administrations held on to the belief that a policy of economic interdependence and political engagement could turn China into a responsible stakeholder, and rejected labeling the US-China relationship as competitive and instead emphasized cooperation. And I think that ambivalence on Washington's part gave Europeans plenty of cover to play fast and loose with in their relationship with China, Chinese money, with Chinese influence. But now that the U.S. has changed course on China, and I think this is a bipartisan development, Europeans will have to face some trade-offs. That brings me to a related and final point, which is the whole question of European strategic autonomy, which links to the point on Europe as a subject. Now, regardless of its specific positioning vis-a-vis Sino-American competition, is the European Union even capable of autonomy in the conduct of its foreign and security policy? Or in other words, can the EU be a subject in international politics and in relation to Sino-American competition? Now, as you may know, the concept of European strategic autonomy constitutes the underlying theme of the 2016 European Global Strategy and has framed most discussions on EU foreign policy and EU security policy in Brussels over the past 4 years or so. But it is not a new concept. I think ever since the EU's common security and defense policy was launched in 1999, most discussions were about autonomy. And back then, most discussions on autonomy and on strategic autonomy, which is a concept that the French, for one, have been using for a long time, were associated with the idea that the EU should be autonomous from NATO and the United States when in conducting external crisis management operations. So the theme of strategic autonomy was very much associated to that of out-of-area operations. However, I would argue that the world has come a long way since the early days of CSDP, the EU's Common Security and Defense Policy, and Europe's emphasis on out-of-area operations, a la Afghanistan, a la Western Balkans. Critically, and going back to the theme, the return of great power competition globally is shifting the emphasis away from expeditionary operations in so-called secondary theaters and towards great power deterrence and defense. That means that any discussion on European strategic autonomy will be hollow, it will be purely rhetorical unless it takes on the challenge of deterrence and defense, great power deterrence and defense. And if we're talking about that, the nuclear question always comes up because a great power can only deter or for that matter, have a credible defense strategy if it's able to match its opponent's moves or potential moves at every step alongside the so-called deterrence escalation ladder, from hybrid low-level warfare to conventional warfare all the way to nuclear. You cannot compartmentalize, particularly if you want to be a subject in international politics and not depend on someone else for your security. And in Europe, Russia's annexation of Crimea has put deterrence and defense back on Europe's security agenda, and Moscow's efforts to modernize its nuclear arsenal also underscores the renewed importance of nuclear weapons for European security. Again, that means that any serious discussion on European strategic autonomy has to address the problem of nuclear deterrence, and that leads to a complicated question, which is that given widespread reluctance around the idea of a German nuclear deterrence, both within Germany and without, are Paris and Berlin ready to reach some sort of compromise or sharing agreement around the French nuclear deterrent, whether bilaterally or through some sort of EU proxy? I would say that this is unlikely. It's unlikely because the idea of national strategic autonomy is very much embedded in France's political DNA, and an independent nuclear deterrent is the jewel of France's autonomy crown, autonomy narrative. And Germany, for its part, may have come to terms with its de facto strategic subordination to the United States through NATO, but I think it's unlikely to sign off on a serious European defense scheme if its role is to be relegated to playing second fiddle to France, let alone the UK, which is the other nuclear power in Europe. I think that red line was already set during the Cold War by former West German Chancellor Willy Brandt. He argued that any European defense scheme independent from NATO would require a serious discussion about the modalities for including West Germany in the process of decision-making relating to the French nuclear deterrent, and he insisted that Germany's role could not be restricted to infantry tasks. So ultimately, and I'm wrapping up, the debate over European strategic autonomy forces Europeans to grapple with such questions as the need for a Euro deterrent, or for that matter, for European technological industrial champions that are able to compete with American or Chinese ones. And this is an issue that's considered by many as the real barometer of strategic autonomy in the era of big data and artificial intelligence. So the question, either way, the question is very similar. Will most Europeans accept to yield Europe's nuclear or technological command to any given European country? If yes, which one? If not, are Europe's key powers ready to accept their dissolution into a European superstate? I think ever since the beginning of the European integration process, the answer to that question, whether Europeans are ready to dissolve into a superstate, has been not now, perhaps in the future. Time has passed, but the answer remains unchanged. Not now, perhaps in the future. And I would argue that insofar as autonomy, or the condition of subject, is a relative concept, Europeans will do well to continue to deliver their economic and security policies, including through the EU, to mitigate the specter of total dependence on Washington. However, as long as they're not ready to sign off on a European superstate, their strategic relationship with the United States and the broader framework of the West remains for them, to quote Churchill, the worst possible path with the exception of all others. I'll leave it at that. Paul, Dimitris, thank you again. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Luis. What a fantastic talk. You touched upon many different things, and you brought everything together very nicely, I thought. A lot of questions come to my mind. I want to invite our audience to submit questions on the chat. I will then be picking them up and ask Louis to address them. I have a couple of mine, if you don't mind. First, we always start with this, and one of the things that I would like perhaps to hear more about. I mean, you did mention China being described as an adversary of the United States in terms of US strategic thinking. And there are also written references to China being an adversary to the European Union as well, in official EU documents. What I'm not so clear in my mind, and that's perhaps a little bit of an amateur's question, but an important nevertheless, that I guess, is what type of threats China presents for the United States and Europe, and are these threats similar? Because without answering this question, the whole idea of a US-EU sort of joint support of whatever international order suits them becomes a little bit academic. So I would like to hear a little bit more from you to elaborate on this. Are the type of Chinese threats similar to both EU and the US?
Should I go now? Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Dimitris. I think that's a terrific question and a very relevant one. I think what type of threats are the threats similar? I would say yes and no. Some of them are, some of them aren't. The EU, as you already alluded to, has uses different lenses to sort of describe its relationship with China. Right? There was this famous Commission statement in which it described China as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. Systemic rival, alluding to China's vision for international order mainly, and a partner mostly, and when it comes to trade and economics, but also some transnational, sort of facing together some transnational challenges. The US does not have that nuance anymore. It used to be there, but it doesn't have that anymore. Now we're hearing from some of Biden's people that there may be some emphasis on how to cooperate with China on certain issues such as climate and so on. We'll see what that means, because I think it's a bit too early to tell. But in any event, my sense is that the Biden team does not dispute the notion of China as a long-term strategic competitor that needs to be countered multidimensionally, so economically, diplomatically, militarily, and so on. No, the threats are different in the sense that the U.S. is a resident power in East Asia and has a number of alliances, and it considers threats to its allies as threats to its own, not least because it has military bases there, it has real estate there. Europeans do not have that issue. They do not have mutual defense commitments, except for some residual stuff in Southeast Asia involving the UK, five-power defense arrangements and so on. They do not have that problem. So it's for the US there's a strong military component to the rise of China and a direct threat to its alliances and its position in East Asia, because the US determines that US forward presence in East Asia is in the American interest, and that China wants the US to keep out of East Asia. So that is something that Europeans do not face. That's clear. On the whole systemic component of China's rise, so looking at the economic dimension and the implications for international order, I think that is something that Europeans and Americans by and large share, because China is a non-democratic country, because there are quite a number of implications related to letting Chinese companies around point on 5G and data and so on, even though there are also issues between Americans and Europeans, as you know, related to privacy and so on and so forth. But I think that on that front, Europeans and Americans are rather close. That has not been quite operationalized during the Trump years because of the really bad climate in transatlantic relations and Trump's attitude towards the EU specifically. But now Biden's people are changing tone. They're saying that they don't want to make this about a naked power contest between the US and China. They want to make it about ideology and values and democracy versus autocracy, and West and expanded West versus China. I think that will be music to the ears of many Europeans, not all, because some of them may see that as the last nail in the coffin of European strategic autonomy. But some we're seeing already some Europeans responding positively to those sorts of voices. I think Europeans Europe's own stance on China has hardened over the last few years. And part of that has to do with US lobbying. Part of it has to do with Europe's own perception of China. So on that front, they are on a similar pace, if not on the same page. Having said that, and finally to wrap this up, it's true that the fact that Europeans value so much the transatlantic relationship and what the US thinks is also an additional factor. I think without that, it would be harder for some European countries to construe China as a threat. So part of it is related to the transatlantic relationship and to Washington's influence. And I think one of the main questions for US strategy in Europe going forward is how to enlist Europeans in the context of its broader global competition with China.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Luis. There is a related question to this that I want to bring to your attention. It goes to the success with which Chinese policy towards Europe in the past decade has succeeded in dividing Europe. So in many ways, Europe's own agency towards this debate has been compromised by the fact that the Chinese economic interests in certain parts of the European Union have increased massively. I'm thinking here more of Italy, other parts of Southern Europe, Greece, and others. So do you think that this kind of ability of Europe to articulate an independent strategic thinking is not only perhaps related to military power, the projection of a more sort of strategically heavy presence, but also perhaps compromised by economic issues and the fact that many European countries nowadays depend on Chinese investment, something which is likely to increase even more in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point and a great question. I agree. I think going back to the sort of the main theme of the talk, both China and the United States in different ways, of course, and with different implications, and like anyone else would do. I mean, this is not a judgment. They are trying, and we've seen that with the Trump administration. The Biden administration may follow a different approach, but they've both tried to play divide and rule politics. They both tried to exploit or even create European divisions to gain leverage over Europe. Right. In the case of China, very clear, and they both try to use the instruments at their disposal, right? Whatever gives them more leverage. In the case of China, it's economic aid to countries that are either politically alienated or financially in need, politically alienated from the EU, i.e. Hungary, or financially in need. And we've seen how China has sort of tried to institutionalize economic cooperation with Central and Eastern European countries around the so-called 17+1 framework. And that has been widely perceived in Brussels as a snag on European unity, in that Beijing has managed to sort of bypass the EU in policy areas that are meant to be core competences of the Union, such as trade, investment, energy, or technology. And the U.S., what has the U.S. been doing? Well, the U.S. has been trying to use the security leverage, particularly on Central and Eastern Europe, right? I mean, we saw Trump and also Pompeo and others from the administration explicitly saying that those countries that cooperate with China on 5G should expect consequences in terms of their security and intelligence cooperation with the United States. So, yeah, this is key, but it's not only related to economics. And we see that there's issue linkage as well, because the Americans were sort of addressing an economic and technological problem and using the security leverage. So that's a very important point, and it's about how external powers try and leverage usually pre-existing divisions, because it's not like you need to create those divisions yourself. You may exacerbate them at times, but they're usually pre-existed division. I mean, it's not that external powers divide and rule Europe; it's that Europe is already divided or features some significant divisions, and that others leverage them.
Let me bring a couple more questions from the audience. It's an interesting one. Why do you think China and not Russia emerged as the chief competitor of the US after the collapse of the USSR, since both of them share the same characteristics of being selective and sort of semi-detached how they engage with the international order?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it has mostly to do with demographics and economic resources. I mean, the fact that China, I mean, the Soviet Union and then Russia was badly damaged after the prolonged competition, and after the end of the Cold War, it sort of adopted a very introspective behavior, and there was a lot of domestic political instability. China has been already since the 80s and definitely during the 90s and the first decade of this century, growing very steadily economically, and that is what has been powering China's rise. Russia cannot compete with China economically, mm-hmm. So I think it's just a matter of economics and demographics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks very much. Another question: what do you think? What do you make of President Macron's recent comments, casting doubts about the reliability of the United States as the guarantor of the international order moving forward? Is there a degree of truth in this, and what are the consequences if this statement holds true?
Well, I think I think that sort of comment sort of generated or would have generated a lot of sympathy in Europe just a few months ago before the U.S. election. But now we're seeing that the Biden administration has a completely different take on this. I mean, they're basically talking about re-entering, revitalizing multilateralism, revitalizing alliances, and making this about about values and not about a naked power contest. So I mean, I realize that. I mean, the French have been pushing for European strategic autonomy, by which really they mean French security leadership in Europe for a long time. And in many ways, Trump's attitude has been good news for them because it has swung many European countries, or at least, made them inch closer towards the French position. Mm-hmm. And now with Biden, it isn't clear what's going to happen to that whole program. Mm-hmm. But my sense is that the reaction to Biden's statements and his people's statements on multilateralism and alliances, the reaction to all that in Brussels has been very positive so far, both in NATO circles and in EU circles.
That's very clear. Another question from Professor Peter Grace. Recent polls in the Czech Republic suggest that the Europeans are now converging on negative views of China. Will that make it easier to come up with a unified EU policy towards China?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we are seeing some sort of move in that direction. The question, I think, to some extent will be how in line should we be with the US and how invested should we be diplomatically, to a lesser extent, I guess, militarily, when it comes to the high end of the competition, right? Territorial disputes and so on and so forth. I think that is still, and precisely going back to your first question, Dimitris, I think that is still likely to generate frictions because many Europeans do not feel they have a dog in that fight, whereas others are probably more sympathetic to the idea of accompanying the Americans, at least diplomatically. So I think European divisions on China are going to become less critical, because it's true that in general you see Europe's elite opinion, at least, and even public opinion, trending in sort of more negative direction. But I think divisions will not go away.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. If I may return to one of your earlier points, I'll try and make this question provocative as we come towards at the end of the of this fantastic talk. You talked about international orders, and you refer to some really excellent pieces of work that the common denominator of which seem to suggest that an international order becomes sustainable once there is a hegemonic power supporting it. And by extension, we see changes to this international order as something that is very problematic. We worry about it, right? A lot of Europeans, a lot of Americans worry about the rise of China, worry about Russia and so on. But why can we not think of an international order that does not have a single hegemon? And why is it wrong for an international order not to have, not why it is normatively wrong for an international order not to have a hegemon, but why is it not possible that an international order operates on the basis of a minimum balance of power, that no one has enough incentive to break it completely, but nobody can dominate it either? To me, that seems like a good plan.
Yeah, that's a central question in international relations scholarship, right? I'm not sure it's a matter of right and wrong, but I think history shows that multipolar orders tend to be more unstable and war prone than both bipolar and, well, we've only really had one. Well, not only one, we've had others before, than both bipolar and unipolar orders, right? That's what the empirical record shows, which is not to say that there couldn't be a more stable or a stable multipolar order in the future. What we have right now, and this has been described by some scholars, I would argue, is perhaps a sort of unipolarity at the global level, but balances of power at the regional level, right? Particularly in some of the key regions, right? Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. I think that has worked pretty well. From a European viewpoint, it has worked rather well because it has, I mean, the US-led order has been in reality a Western-led order that has afforded Europeans a position of sort of preeminence or top lieutenant status, if you will, to the United States in some of the global economic and political institutions, right? The UN Security Council, well, you have 2 European seats from 2 powers that do not have the demographics or the economics for that status. Also in the WTO, in the World Bank, in the IMF. I mean, you have a prominent position. Europeans have a prominent position. They're punching way above their weight, right? So I think the current order has treated Europeans rather well. And now, as U.S. primacy sort of, I don't want to say wanes, because it's not clear. I think the United States is still in a pretty solid position, including vis-a-vis China, in the sense that the foundations of American power are very strong, I think. But certainly as U.S. primacy evolves, and we can certainly say that it's not what it used to be. Certainly in the 1990s, some Europeans feel that there's an opportunity to sort of renegotiate the transatlantic relationship and their status within the system from a position of strength. I don't know if that's true, but yeah. Anyway, I realize I took the question in a sort of different direction, sort of trying to look at it.
It's an excellent it's an excellent answer. I guess what I was getting to is whether you think the evidence of European ambivalence towards China, as indeed evidence of European ambivalence, increasing European ambivalence towards the US, are necessarily a bad thing.
I wouldn't look at it in terms of good versus bad. I think it's simply, I think European ambivalence is simply not sustainable. I think it's, there will always be some degree of ambivalence, even during the Cold War, which was different because that was a direct threat to Europe, including military threat. But even then, you had ambivalence if certainly on part of significant parts of European public opinion, West German public opinion, and other countries in Western Europe, and parts of the leadership. So there's always going to be some degree of ambivalence. But I think ambivalence with a capital A is simply not sustainable because Europe is still, I mean, contemporary Europe is by and large a byproduct, or to considerable extent, a byproduct of American power. And you still have a significant US military presence in Europe. There's a lot of US soft power going around. Most European countries continue to think that the transatlantic relationship is the bedrock of their security and the European security architecture. So I think in that context, and there are many historical and economic and cultural bonds tying Europe and America together. I mean, in a sense, and historically speaking, I think America, and as a Spaniard, I would say both Americas, both North and South, is an extension of Europe, and it gives strategic depth and historical depth to Europe. So I think that ambivalence is simply, there will always be a degree of ambivalence, but I think ambivalence, like seriously speaking, is not, I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think it's realistic.
That's very good. I think that's a very good point, perhaps, for us to reflect on this excellent presentation. Is ambivalence long-term sustainable or advisable for the EU? No one has a clear answer. I can see that. I just want to take this opportunity to thank Luis Simón for this talk. I think we all feel we learn an awful lot from it, and you made us all think, which is fantastic. Also, thanking you for demonstrating the best possible way that you could have a Zoom meeting without a PowerPoint presentation and still keep it very interesting and engaging. So thanks for that too, Luis. And we do all hope that not before too long, we'll welcome you in person in Manchester for a follow-up talk.
Thank you, Dimitris, and thanks Paul and the whole team. It was great fun and a pleasure to do this.
Over to Paul for the final goodbye.
Oh, thanks, Dimitris, and thanks so much, Louise. That was absolutely fantastic. I was making notes and learning a lot throughout the whole thing, so thank you. I'll only flag before saying thank you to Louise one more time. But next term, we have some great speakers coming up as well. Vivian Schmitz, for example, who is based at Boston University, one of the leading scholars in international relations, is going to be joining us. So we really hope to see you next term. In the meantime, have a great break and a great end of term as well. But for now, on behalf of everyone at the Manchester JMCE Centre of Excellence, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Professor Dr. Louise Simón. Thank you.